Berlin, 1918. A teenage girl is walking through the city with a necklace around her throat, a Star of David given to her by the Jewish man she loves. She is learning his language. She is attending his meetings. She is, by every outward sign, a person headed somewhere entirely different from where she will end up. Her name is Magda Friedlander. 27 years later, she will be in a room beneath a burning city, standing over 6 sleeping children, her children with a cyanide capsule in her hand. The man whose star she once wore will have been dead for less than 24 hours. This is the story of the distance between those two moments. It is not a short distance, and it is not as much as we might wish it to be an impossible one. Ladies and gentlemen, welcome to Quiet Sovereigns. History has a way of remembering only what it wants to remember. It remembers the men at the podiums, the speeches that moved nations, the wars that rewrote maps. It photographs the victors standing in front of ruined cities. It preserves the diaries of generals, the telegrams of presidents, the last testament of tyrants. And somewhere in the margins of all these photographs, just off to the side, slightly out of frame, there is usually a woman, smiling, composed, her hands folded in her lap. Tonight's story is about one of those women. She was not a soldier. She was not a politician. She held no elected office, commanded no armies, signed no treaties that shaped the fate of nations. And yet she sat at the center of the most destructive political machine the modern world had ever seen. She dined with a man whose name would become synonymous with genocide. She attended his dinner parties and laughed at his jokes and lit up a room in ways that even his closest lieutenants took note of. Some of them called her the most elegant woman in Berlin. Others called her the true heart of the Third Reich. The world would come to remember her as the wife of Joseph Goebbels, the woman who stood beside Hitler's chief propagandist, who bore him 6 children, who posed for photographs in the German countryside with her husband and the Führer and their beautiful, fair-haired sons and daughters. The propaganda machine of Nazi Germany held her up as the ideal German mother. 6 children, all beginning with the letter H. A family that looked, on paper, like a dream. But what the photographs did not show, what the propaganda never mentioned, what almost no documentary has paused long enough to say was what Magda Goebbels had been before all of this. Before she was First Lady of the Third Reich. Before she was a symbol of Aryan womanhood. Before she stood in every official photograph, upright and immovable beside the Führer. There was a girl in Berlin, sometime around 1918. She was young, 17, perhaps 18. She was in love, and the man she loved had given her a necklace, a small, simple piece of jewelry that she wore in public, without apology, without concealment. A Star of David. She was not Jewish, but she wore it because he was, and she learned Hebrew for him, and she attended Zionist meetings at his side because she believed, in that moment of her life, that she was going somewhere with him, perhaps to Palestine, perhaps to a life that had nothing to do with Germany at all. That girl disappeared. Something replaced her. Tonight, we try to understand what happened in between. This is the story of Magda Goebbels, the woman who became the thing that destroyed her first love. She was born illegitimate. That was the first thing the world tried to erase about Magda Goebbels before she erased it herself. The 11th of November 1901, Berlin. Her mother, Auguste Behrendt, was a housemaid. Her father, Oskar Ritschl, was a building contractor. They were not married when Magda came into the world, and they would not remain together long after. By the time she was 4 or 5 years old, her parents had separated, and Magda found herself in that particular kind of childhood uncertainty that leaves a mark. No photograph can show the kind where a child learns very early that the ground beneath her feet can shift without warning. Her mother remarried. The new husband's name was Richard Friedlander. He was Jewish. He was also, by most accounts, a good man, a businessman, prosperous, steady, the kind of stepfather who takes a child in and gives her what stability looks like. He gave Magda more than a home. He gave her his name. For years, she moved through the world as Magda Friedlander, carrying the surname of a Jewish man as casually as if she had been born to it. She went to school with it. She grew up in it. She attended a Catholic convent school, then later a prestigious ladies' college near Goslar in the German countryside. And somewhere in that span of years, in the boarding schools and the parlors of early Weimar Germany, in the restless, searching atmosphere of a country that had just lost a war and did not yet know what it was going to become, Magda Friedlander made a friend. Her name was Lisa Alosorov. Lisa's family had come from Russia, part of the great Jewish migration westward across Europe in the early 20th century. The Alosorovs had settled in Berlin, and Lisa had grown up there bright, curious, politically alive, in the way that young Jewish intellectuals in Weimar Germany so often were. She and Magda became close, and through Lisa, Magda met Lisa's brother. His name was Chaim Alosorov. He was 2 years older than Magda, born in 1899 inches, what is now Ukraine. He had grown up passionate about ideas, about history, about the future of his people. By the time he and Magda met, he was already deeply immersed in the Zionist movement, that urgent, idealistic project to establish a Jewish homeland in Palestine. He spoke with a kind of conviction that makes young people feel that the world is large and that their place in it matters. Magda, it seems, was not indifferent to any of this. What happened between them is not fully documented in the way that historians wish things were documented, with letters dated and archived, with diaries cross-referenced against independent sources. What we have instead is the account of historian Corinne Schindler, who examined the relationship in his scholarly work on Zionism and its political rivalries. According to Schindler's research, Magda and Chaim became intimate. They went to Zionist meetings together. She attended Jewish youth club gatherings at his side, the only non-Jewish person in rooms full of young people debating the future of a homeland she had no ancestral claim to. And he gave her a necklace, a Star of David, worn in public, on the streets of Berlin, without apparent embarrassment. According to Schindler's account, she also began learning Hebrew. Whether she was in love with Chaim himself, or in love with the world he opened up for her, that particular question is one that history cannot answer. Perhaps she could not have answered it herself. But she wore the star, and she learned the words. And for a period of her young life, she seems to have been headed somewhere entirely different from where she ended up. Then Chaim left. He moved to Palestine, absorbed fully into the Zionist project, into a life and a cause that existed thousands of miles from Berlin. He married a Jewish woman. He became, in time, one of the most important Zionist political figures of his era, head of the political department of the Jewish Agency, a man negotiating with governments on behalf of an entire people. The relationship with Magda, whatever it had been, ended. He moved on. She was left behind, and something in her shifted. It is difficult to say, from this distance, whether the departure of Chaim Arosorov was the thing that broke something in Magda, or whether it was merely the first in a long series of broken things that she would learn to paper over with new identities. What we can say is this: the girl who had worn a Star of David and attended Zionist meetings and studied Hebrew did not remain that girl. She moved on, as people do. She found other rooms to walk into, other worlds to inhabit. The first of those worlds was wealth. In 1920, on a train back to school, Magda met a man named Günter Quandt. He was 38 years old. She was 19. He was one of the wealthiest industrialists in Germany, a widower with 2 sons, a man who had built his fortune in textiles and was expanding it rapidly into batteries and chemicals and whatever else the post-war German economy was generating. He was not handsome, not romantic, not the kind of man a 19-year-old girl dreams about when she is learning Hebrew for someone she loves. But he was powerful, and he was interested in her. They married in 1921. Their son, Harald, was born that same year. It was, by most accounts, a marriage of calculation on both sides, though the calculation was not equal. Quandt wanted a young, elegant wife to manage his household and fill the social role that wealth required. Magda wanted security and, perhaps, the kind of legitimacy that marrying into an established German family could provide to a girl who had started life as an illegitimate child carrying a Jewish surname. Before they married, according to multiple sources, Quandt demanded that her birth certificate be amended to declare her legitimate and that her adopted surname, Friedlander, be removed from all official records. Just like that, Richard Friedlander was erased from Magda's name. She became Magda Quandt. She moved into the large Quandt estate, managed the household, attended the social functions that wealth required. She had a child. She lived, for several years, in the version of stability that money can purchase, the kind that looks solid from the outside and fails from the inside, like wearing someone else's clothes. By 1929, the marriage was finished. Quandt had discovered she was having an affair. He filed for divorce. Magda walked away with a generous financial settlement, enough to live comfortably, enough to not be desperate. What she did not walk away with was any clear sense of who she was or what she was for. She was 28 years old. She had 1 son. She had been a boarding school girl, a Zionist sympathizer, a wealthy industrialist wife, and now a divorcee. The ground beneath her feet had shifted again. In the restless, volatile Berlin of 1930, a city electric with political extremism, with economic collapse, with the sound of competing ideologies shouting themselves hoarse on every street corner, Magda Quandt went to a rally. A friend had suggested it. The National Socialist German Workers' Party was gaining momentum. Their speakers were energetic, certain, furious. The hall was full. Magda sat down and listened. Later, she would describe the moment as transformative. She had found, she said, something to believe in. What she had found, in the precise clinical language of retrospect, was a movement that promised order out of chaos, and a man at its center who seemed to her, in those early days, like the embodiment of everything Germany needed, and everything she had been missing. His name was Adolf Hitler. She had not yet met him, but she had heard the voice. and something in her recognized it or thought it did. She would spend the rest of her life learning what that recognition had cost her. She walked into the Berlin offices of the National Socialist German Workers' Party in the autumn of 1930 as a volunteer. That word volunteer is worth pausing on. Magda Kwan did not need the work. She had a settlement from Günter Kwan, her apartment, her son Harald, in school. She was not desperate in the way that many Germans were desperate in 1930, standing in bread lines, watching their savings dissolve, wondering whether the Weimar Republic would survive the week. She had options. She chose this one. She was put to work in the Berlin party headquarters, doing administrative tasks, filing, organizing, the quiet labor that keeps any organization running. And then, within a few weeks, she was invited to take charge of a more sensitive assignment, managing the private papers of the Berlin district leader. His name was Joseph Goebbels. He was 33 years old, small, dark, with a clubfoot that had kept him out of the war, and a mind that had compensated for every physical disadvantage by becoming, in the words of those who encountered him, one of the most brilliant propagandists of his age. He had a doctorate in literature from Heidelberg. He had written a novel nobody read, and a diary that he had been keeping obsessively since adolescence. He needed women the way some men need air constantly, urgently, with a ferocity that his own diary described in terms that were equal parts lust and politics. When Magda Kwan arrived in his office, Joseph Goebbels looked up from his desk. Later, he would write in his diary, in his characteristically breathless style, that she had appeared at his door like something unexpected, elegant, self-possessed, not the kind of woman who usually ended up sorting files in a party office. She had been in the building only a few weeks before he began paying attention to her. What followed was not a love story in any conventional sense, though it was, for a time, something that resembled one. Goebbels pursued Magda with the same focused intensity he brought to everything he did. He sent her flowers. He arranged to spend time with her. He wrote about her in his diary with a mixture of genuine attraction and cold strategic awareness that is, in retrospect, difficult to read. In February 1931, on a short trip to Weimar with a group of party friends, the two became romantically involved. By April, they were making plans. "We have made a solemn vow to each other," Goebbels wrote in his diary at the time. "When we have conquered the Reich, we will become man and wife. I am very happy. When we have conquered the Reich, not when we have fallen in love, not when we have built a life. When we have conquered." That sentence, sitting quietly in a private diary entry from 1931, contains most of what one needs to know about the marriage that followed. But what did Magda want? This is the question that her biographers have circled for decades. And it is the question this story cannot fully answer, because Magda Goebbels never answered it herself. She left no memoir. She gave no interviews that survive in any meaningful form. She did not write a diary, or if she did, it has not been found. What we have are the accounts of those around her husband's diary, the memoirs of those who knew her, the observations of people who watched her move through the rooms of the Third Reich. And what those accounts suggest is something stranger and more unsettling than a simple story of ambition. She was quoted by more than one person who knew her as saying something along these lines, that love was meant for husbands, but her feelings for Hitler were something else entirely, something greater, something she would give her life for. Read that sentence carefully. It was not her husband she felt this way about. It was Hitler. According to her biographers, Magda had become genuinely transfixed by Adolf Hitler, not as a lover, not as a romantic prospect, but as something harder to name. An ideal. A symbol. A man she believed in the way that some people believe in something larger than themselves. Hitler, for his part, was drawn to Magda enough that some historians have suggested he played an active role in encouraging her relationship with Goebbels. He could not marry, he believed, because his appeal to German women depended on his appearing available to all of them, but he could have, in Magda, someone close, someone at the table, someone who could be his in every way, except officially. Magda married Goebbels in December 1931. Hitler served as the official witness. There is a photograph from that day. Magda in white, Goebbels beside her, and behind them half smiling, standing slightly apart from the couple, as if observing rather than participating Adolf Hitler. Her 10-year-old son Harald stands nearby in a small suit, looking at the camera with an expression that is simply too young to know what it is looking at. It is one of the more quietly disturbing photographs of the 20th century. With her marriage, Magda stepped fully into the apparatus of the Third Reich. She became the public face of the ideal Nazi family. 6 children born between 1932 and 1940, all with names beginning with H. She appeared at official functions. She posed for propaganda photographs. She was photographed on holidays with her children and her husband and her Führer, laughing on mountain terraces, picnicking in meadows, presenting the world with an image of wholesome German life that the propaganda ministry could distribute to every corner of the country. The image was a lie, of course. Most images produced by that ministry were, but the lie that surrounded Magda Goebbels was more particular and more personal than the usual lies of political propaganda, because behind the photographs, the marriage was already a facade held together not by love or even by mutual respect, but by shared ambition and the explicit requirements of the state. Joseph Goebbels did not stop pursuing other women after his wedding. He pursued them constantly, obsessively, with a lack of discretion that periodically erupted into public scandal. Magda knew. She endured. She retaliated, on at least one occasion, with an affair of her own with Karl Hanke, her husband's state secretary, a relationship that she conducted with enough visibility to make clear it was not a secret. They were, in the language of their time, a modern couple. They were, in the language of any time, two people locked together by something other than love. And through all of it, through the official functions, and the propaganda photographs, and the children's birthday parties attended by the man she believed in more than she believed in her own husband, something was happening in Germany that Magda Goebbels did not stop. In 1933, the same year Hitler became Chancellor of Germany, a man named Chaim Arlosorow traveled to Berlin. He was no longer the young idealist Magda had known 15 years earlier. He was now head of the political department of the Jewish Agency, one of the most senior Zionist political figures in the world, a man negotiating on behalf of the entire Jewish community in Palestine. He had come to Berlin to conduct sensitive negotiations with the new Nazi government talks that would eventually lead to the Havara Agreement, an arrangement by which German Jews could transfer some of their assets to Palestine upon emigrating, in exchange for an end to the Jewish boycott of German goods. It was, under the circumstances, an extraordinary errand. And while he was in Berlin on those streets where Magda had once worn his star, Chaim Arlosorow saw a newspaper headline. Nazi chief weds Jewess. He recognized the name. He understood what it meant. According to accounts that emerged later, Magda sent him a private message. Leave Germany, she told him. Leave immediately. She was afraid for him or afraid for herself, or both. The accounts do not fully agree on her motivation. What they agree on is that she warned him. He left. 2 weeks after returning to Tel Aviv, on the 16th of June 1933, Chaim Arlosorow was shot while walking on the beach with his wife. He died of his wounds that night. He was 34 years old. The murder was never officially solved. 3 theories emerged over the decades: that it was the work of right-wing Zionist opponents who objected to his negotiations with the Nazis, that it was the work of Arab nationalists, or, in a theory that surfaced in the Israeli press in the mid-1970s, that Joseph Goebbels had sent agents to kill him, to ensure that the story of his wife's past remained buried. That last theory has never been proven. It has never been disproven. What is certain is that after June 1933, Chaim Arlosorow was gone, and the Star of David was gone, and Magda Friedlander was gone. In their place stood Magda Goebbels, the First Lady of the Third Reich, mother of 6, official witness to a vision of German life that had no room for anything she had once been. She had erased the name. She would erase the rest. There was only one thing left that connected her to Richard Friedlander, the Jewish stepfather who had given her his name, who had raised her, who had been a steady presence in the unsteady years of her childhood. In 1939, Richard Friedlander was arrested. He was sent to Buchenwald concentration camp. He died there. No record exists of any intervention by Magda Goebbels, no letter written on his behalf, no conversation noted by those around her, no request made to her husband, who by that point was one of the most powerful men in Germany. Nothing. The man whose name she had carried through her childhood died in a camp, while his adopted daughter sat at Adolf Hitler's dinner table. Some silences are louder than anything a person ever says. There is a particular kind of power that has no official name. It does not appear on any organizational chart. It carries no title, no rank, no salary. It cannot be inherited, or appointed, or revoked by any formal process. And yet, those who have watched power up close, who have stood close enough to the source of it to feel its heat, know that this nameless kind is sometimes the most durable of all. Magda Goebbels had it. By 1934, 3 years into her marriage, she had become something that the Third Reich had not entirely planned for and did not quite know what to do with. A woman who was genuinely indispensable to the image of the regime, not because of what she did, but because of what she represented. The propaganda machine her husband ran needed a face for the ideal German family. It needed a woman who was elegant without being threatening, maternal without being dull, sophisticated enough to sit across from foreign dignitaries, and simple enough to be photographed picking flowers with her children. Magda was all of these things simultaneously, and she wore them without apparent effort, which made her more valuable still, Hitler noticed. Those who observed them together in those years describe a relationship that defies easy categorization. It was not romantic, at least not in any way that left a documented record. It was something more complicated, a mutual fascination, a kind of emotional dependency that ran deeper, on her side, than any ordinary admiration. She has said it herself, to more than one person, that her feelings for Hitler exceeded what she felt for her husband, that she would give her life for him, that love was meant for husbands, but this was something else. For his part, Hitler appeared genuinely fond of Magda. He spent time with the Goebbels children, he attended their birthday parties, he sat at their dinner table. He had, in the Goebbels household, the closest thing he permitted himself to a domestic life, a glimpse of the family existence he publicly championed but privately avoided. Magda provided that glimpse, and in providing it, she became, in some unspoken way, necessary to him. This was the arrangement. This was what her life had become. She presided over a household that functioned as a kind of extension of the Reich Chancellery, a place where the business of the regime was conducted over meals, where alliances were managed and information was exchanged, and the Führer could relax in the company of people he trusted. 6 children moved through those rooms. Helga born in 1932, Hilda in 1934, Helmut in 1935, Holder in 1937, Hedda in 1938, Heide in 1940, all beginning with H. Whether this was deliberate homage to Hitler, as legend has it, or simply coincidence that hardened into family tradition, historians have never settled definitively. What is settled is that the children were real, and that they were beautiful, and that they were photographed constantly, and that the photographs were distributed across Germany as evidence of what the new Germany was building. Magda managed all of it. The household, the children, the official appearances, the social calendar that required her to be charming to foreign visitors whose countries her husband's ministry was simultaneously working to destabilize. She did it with a composure that those around her found either admirable or unsettling, depending on how closely they looked. And the closer one looked, the more unsettling it became. Because this was also the period in which the consequences of everything the Third Reich stood for were becoming impossible to ignore, not for historians looking back, but for anyone paying attention at the time. The Nuremberg laws of 1935 had stripped German Jews of their citizenship. The organized brutality of the regime was not hidden. It was announced, codified, bureaucratized. The man at Magda's dinner table had set all of this in motion. The man she said she would give her life for had signed the orders. And Richard Friedlander, the man who had given her his name, who had been her stepfather through the formative years of her childhood, who had raised her, and sheltered her, and sent her to school, was still alive in Germany during this period. Still trying to navigate the increasingly dangerous terrain of being a Jewish man in the country that was hunting Jewish men. We do not know what conversations, if any, passed between them in these years. There are no letters on record, no visits documented. What we know is that by 1939, when the apparatus of the regime moved against him, Magda did not move to stop it. She could have asked her husband. Her husband was the Reich Minister of Public Enlightenment and Propaganda, one of Hitler's most powerful and trusted lieutenants. A single word in the right ear, from the right wife, at the right dinner table, might have been enough. People with far less access had managed to protect individuals from the machinery of the state in those early years, before the machinery became entirely unstoppable. Magda said nothing, or, if she did, nothing came of it. Richard Friedlander was sent to Buchenwald in 1938. He died there in 1939. His name appears in the records of the camp, the way most names appear there, as a number attached to a date. The date is the date of his death. There is no other annotation. Meanwhile, the woman who had once been Magda Friedlander was photographed at the Berlin Sportpalast, seated in the front row as her husband delivered speeches that inflamed the crowd to heights of nationalist fury. She was photographed at the Berghof, Hitler's alpine residence, on summer afternoons that look, in the surviving images, almost peaceful. Mountains in the background, children on the grass, men in uniform laughing at something just out of frame. She appears in all of these photographs the same way, composed, upright, present. There is no photograph in which she looks troubled. This is either a testament to her self-control, or evidence of something harder to accept that she had, by this point, completed the erasure she had begun in 1921 when Günther Quandt removed the name Friedlander from her birth certificate. That the girl who had worn a Star of David had not merely been suppressed, but genuinely replaced. That Magda Goebbels had become, in the fullest possible sense, the woman the Third Reich needed her to be, and that this transformation had not cost her what one might expect it to cost a person. Or perhaps the photographs simply cannot show what a face hides. There was, in those years, at least one moment when the composure cracked, one moment when the private Magda became briefly, startlingly visible. It happened in 1938, and it had nothing to do with ideology, or politics, or the fate of Jewish men in German concentration camps. It had to do with a Czech actress named Lida Barová. Joseph Goebbels had been conducting affairs throughout their marriage. This was not unknown to Magda, and she had learned, over the years, to accommodate it, to look away from what she could not change, to maintain the surface of the marriage that the regime required. But in 1936, Goebbels became involved with Barova in a way that was different from his previous entanglements. It was not discreet, it was not brief. He appeared with her publicly, brought her into their social circle, and by 1938 had reached the point of telling Magda that he wanted a divorce. Not an affair, a divorce. He wanted to leave her. For a Czech woman, a Slavic actress, exactly the kind of woman that Nazi racial ideology was supposed to render undesirable, Magda did not respond by retreating quietly. She did not absorb this particular blow the way she had absorbed others. She went to Hitler. She requested, formally, permission to divorce her husband. She wanted to leave Germany, she said. Start again elsewhere. Take the children and go. Hitler refused. He refused not because he cared about her happiness or Goebbels's, but because the Goebbels marriage was a propaganda asset that the Reich could not afford to sacrifice. A divorced propaganda minister, whose wife had fled to a foreign country with his children, was not the image of the ideal German family that his own ministry had spent years constructing. Hitler summoned both of them to Obersalzberg. He told them, separately and then together, that their personal feelings were irrelevant to the needs of the state. He forced Goebbels to end the affair. He made them both promise, in his presence, to remain together. And they did. Goebbels telephoned Barova. He told her it was over. She later recalled that he wept during the call. He told her he loved her. And then he hung up and went back to his wife, and the family photographs resumed. Magda stayed. Not because she forgave her husband. Not because the marriage had been repaired. She stayed because the one person in the world whose words she could not refuse had told her to. She stayed for Hitler. And Hitler, having saved the marriage he required, went back to his own affairs, to the preparations for the war he was planning, to the machinery of annihilation he was assembling, to the vision of Germany he was building on the bones of people like Richard Friedlander. Magda sat at his table and poured the wine. Outside, in the streets of Berlin, November 1938 arrived. And with it, Kristallnacht, the night of broken glass. The night the windows of Jewish businesses and synagogues across Germany were shattered by coordinated mobs while police stood aside and watched. The man who organized it was Joseph Goebbels, who had just been humiliated by Hitler over the Barova affair, and who threw himself into the orchestration of violence with the energy of a man who needed, urgently, to rehabilitate himself in the eyes of his Führer. The night the glass broke across Germany, Magda was home. Where else would she be? By 1943, the war had turned. Anyone paying attention could feel it, the shift in temperature that precedes a collapse, that particular quality of silence in official communications. That means the news being withheld is worse than the news being released. Stalingrad had fallen in February. 200,000 German soldiers were dead or captured on the Eastern Front. The Reich, that had been promised to last 1,000 years, was, for those close enough to see it clearly, beginning to show the fractures that precede an ending. Joseph Goebbels responded to this information the way he responded to every challenge, with words. In February 1943, he stood at the Berlin Sportpalast before a carefully selected audience of 14,000 and delivered what would become the most famous speech of his career. He asked the crowd whether they wanted total war. They screamed that they did. He asked again, louder. They screamed louder. The cameras recorded it all, and the recordings were distributed across Germany as evidence that the national will remained unbroken. Magda sat in the front row. She had sat in the front row for 12 years now. She had been in that seat for the rallies and the speeches, and the official ceremonies and the private dinners, where the future of Europe was discussed over good wine by men who were conducting a genocide. She had smiled in the right places, and spoken in the right tone, and presented, to every camera that pointed in her direction, the face that the regime required of her. But something was changing. Those who knew her in these years describe a woman who was, beneath the surface of her composure, exhausted, not in the ordinary way of someone who has been working too hard, but in the deeper way of someone who has been maintaining a performance for so long that the performer and the performance have begun to blur in ways that are difficult to untangle. Her marriage remained, in private, what it had always been, a transaction dressed in the language of family. Goebbels had not stopped his pursuit of other women after the Barova crisis. He had simply become more careful about it, more discreet, more practiced in the art of conducting a double life that Hitler's direct intervention had forced him to manage with greater subtlety. Magda knew. She always knew. There is no evidence that she cared anymore, not in the way she had cared during the Barova affair, when something in her had risen up and gone directly to the most powerful man in Germany to demand relief. That impulse, the impulse to resist, to demand something for herself, seems to have quieted in her after 1938. What replaced it is harder to describe, a kind of settling, a narrowing of what she permitted herself to want. What she wanted, it seems, was Hitler. Not in any intimate sense, but in the sense that a person can want to be near the thing they have organized their entire existence around. She wanted proximity to him, the warmth of his approval, the sense that the life she had built with all its costs, with all its erasures, had been worth building because it had placed her at the center of something that mattered. He was kind to her children. He called Helmut, her only son with Goebbels, by a nickname. He sat with the girls at the dinner table and let them climb on the furniture. In the photographs from those years, he looks almost gentle with them, this man who was signing orders that were killing millions of people in countries to the east. The children did not know what he was. They knew only that he came to dinner and was patient with them, and that their mother's face changed when he was in the room. Helga, the oldest, was 11 by 1943, old enough to notice things. Old enough, perhaps, to understand that the man her mother looked at that way was not her father. But the children are not the story yet. The children will come later, in the way that all unbearable things come later than you think, and then all at once. The story now is what Magda was doing in those middle years, in the long corridor between the early triumph of the Reich and its final implosion. She was doing what she had always done, maintaining the surface, attending the functions, presenting the face, and gradually, in ways that the surviving account suggests without fully documenting, beginning to understand that the surface was all there was. Her husband held no genuine affection for her. This she had accepted. The regime held no genuine affection for her, either it held her useful, which is a different thing, and would discard her the moment she ceased to be useful, as it had discarded everyone else. And Hitler, the man she had said she would give her life for, the man she had stayed married for when she wanted to leave, the man whose presence at a dinner table had felt, for a decade, like the justification for everything Hitler was conducting a war that was now visibly failing, and he was not asking her opinion about it. And there were days, surely, when she sat in the large house with its 6 children and its propaganda-approved furnishings and understood, with a clarity that she did not permit herself to examine too closely, that she had traded everything she once was for this, for a house, for a role, for proximity to a man who needed her to be there but did not need her to be herself. In the spring of 1945, as Soviet forces closed in on Berlin from the east and American forces pressed in from the west, Hitler retreated underground, literally underground, into the Führerbunker beneath the Reich Chancellery, a concrete warren of rooms and corridors 20 feet below the surface of a city that was being bombed into rubble. His senior staff followed him. His personal secretary, Trado Junge, went down into the bunker. His doctor went, his valet went, and Magda Goebbels, who did not have to be there, whose husband had in fact been ordered by Hitler to leave Berlin, to evacuate south, to survive, decided to go underground as well. She brought the children, Helga, 13, Hilde, 11, Helmut, 9, Holde, 8, Hedda, 7, Heide, 4. She brought all 6 of them down into the bunker. Albert Speer, one of Hitler's senior architects, and a man who had known Magda for years, attempted to persuade her not to. Others made similar arguments. The children could be taken out of Berlin. There were ways. People were finding ways. The war was effectively over. The only question was how much destruction would accompany the end. Magda refused every offer. The 30th of April, 1945. Adolf Hitler married Eva Braun in a small ceremony in the bunker conference room at midnight. It was, by every account, a brief and businesslike affair. A civil registrar brought underground, the paperwork completed, a small gathering of witnesses who stood in the narrow corridor and watched 2 people exchange vows in a concrete room while the city above them burned. Magda was not invited. This detail is not insignificant. In all the years of her devotion, all the dinners, all the official appearances, all the compromises and erasures and accommodations, she had not been included in the thing that mattered most to Hitler personally. She was useful to him. She was necessary to the image he had constructed and the household he had used as a domestic sanctuary. But when the moment came for him to choose who stood beside him at the end, he chose Eva Braun. Eva Braun, whom Magda had always known about and never acknowledged. Eva Braun, who had lived in careful concealment for years while Magda sat at the official table. Eva Braun, who was now, for approximately 36 hours, Hitler's wife. What Magda felt about this is not recorded. The following afternoon, April 30, at approximately 3:30, Hitler and Eva Braun committed suicide in their private quarters. Eva Braun bit down on a cyanide capsule. Hitler shot himself. Their bodies were carried upstairs to the Reich Chancellery garden, doused in petrol, and burned. The noise in the bunker after, those present recalled, was a particular kind of silence. The kind that follows the ending of something so large that the people around it do not yet have language for what they are experiencing. Magda had language for it. She had been preparing it for weeks. She went to her children. The children had been in the bunker for several days by this point, brought down when the bombing above became too constant and too close for even Magda's capacity for maintaining normalcy to bridge. They had adapted to the underground life with the particular resilience of children who do not fully understand what they are adapting to. They played in the corridors. They were given lessons. They were told, in the careful language that adults use when they are lying to children about something irreversible, that the noise above was temporary and that soon things would return to how they had been. Helga, at 13, was old enough to suspect that this was not true. The others, Hilde at 11, Helmut at 9, Holde at 8, Hedda at 7, Heide at 4, were young enough to believe what they were told, or young enough to need to believe it, which amounts to the same thing. There are accounts from those in the bunker during those final days that describe the Goebbels children as cheerful, as well-behaved, as the kind of children who make adults smile, in spite of themselves bringing a quality of ordinary life into a place that has ceased to be ordinary in any sense. One witness recalled Helmut standing in a corridor with a toy, making the sounds of an engine with his mouth. Heide, 4 years old, had recently learned a song. She sang it for Hitler. He smiled. This is what it looked like from the outside. On the evening of May 1, Magda summoned an SS dentist named Helmut Kunz to the family quarters. She told him, according to his later testimony, that the decision had been made. She asked him to administer morphine injections to each of the children to sedate them, to make them sleep, so that what came next would be painless. So that they would not know. Kunz complied. He moved through the room with the bunk beds, where the children had been sleeping 3 sets of bunks in a small space, and injected each child in turn. Helga, Hilde, Helmut, Holde, Hedda, Heide. The youngest first, or the oldest accounts differ on the order, and the discrepancy is perhaps the most merciful thing about the documentation of what happened in that room. When the morphine had taken effect, and the children were unconscious, Kunz stepped back. He would later testify that, at this point, he refused to go further, that he would not administer the cyanide himself, would not be the one to break the capsules. He left the room and went to find Dr. Ludwig Stumpfegger, Hitler's personal physician. What happened in the interval between Kunz's departure and Stumpfegger's arrival is not documented with certainty. Some accounts suggest Magda entered the room alone. Others suggest she waited outside, seated in a chair in the corridor, not moving, not speaking. Trado Junge, who was present in the bunker that night, later recalled the moment when Stumpfegger came back out of the children's room. He nodded at Magda without speaking. She stood up. She was shaking. Then she stopped shaking. It was done. The 6 children were found the following morning by Soviet troops who entered the bunker on May 2. They were dressed in their night clothes. The girls had ribbons in their hair tied, presumably, before they were sedated. In the ordinary evening routine of children being put to bed, they lay in their bunks as though sleeping. Post-mortem examination revealed bruising around the mouth of Helga, the eldest. She was 13 years old. The bruising was consistent with resistance, with the jaw clenching against something being forced between the teeth, the body's last instinct asserting itself even after the mind had been sedated into unconsciousness. She had, perhaps, felt something, perhaps woken for a moment, perhaps understood, in that moment between sleep and death, that the person standing over her was her mother. Perhaps not. The uncertainty is its own particular horror. Magda Goebbels walked out of that room and up the stairs and into the bombed-out garden of the Reich Chancellery. Joseph Goebbels was waiting. They had been married for 14 years. They had produced 6 children together and presented themselves, for all 14 of those years, as the model of everything the Third Reich claimed to stand for: family, devotion, sacrifice, the willingness to subordinate personal happiness to the demands of the nation and the Führer. The nation was rubble. The Führer was ash in the garden, 20 feet away. What passed between them in those final minutes is not recorded. There are accounts that suggest they did not speak at all. There are accounts that suggest a few words were exchanged, something brief and functional, a confirmation of what was about to happen rather than a conversation about it. Joseph Goebbels was not, in the end, a man given to the kind of silence that the moment perhaps deserved. But even he seems to have recognized that there was nothing left to say. The details of how they died differed depending on the source. One account holds that they each bit down on cyanide and were then shot by an SS aide. Another holds that Goebbels shot his wife and then himself. What the accounts agree on is the aftermath. 2 bodies, partially burned, lying in the garden. Soviet troops found them on the afternoon of May 2, not far from the place where Hitler and Eva Braun had been burned the day before. Magda Goebbels was 43 years old. There is a letter. She wrote it in April, in the weeks before the end, addressed to her son Harald, the child from her first marriage, the child who was not Joseph Goebbels's, the child who was at that moment a prisoner of war in North Africa, and therefore alive, and therefore the only one she was writing to rather than taking with her. The letter has survived. In it, she does not express doubt. She does not ask for forgiveness. She does not describe what she is going to do to the other 6 in any language that could be called anguish. What she writes, instead, is this. Harald, my dear son, I want to give you what I learned in life. Be loyal. Loyal to yourself, loyal to the people, and loyal to your country. Be proud of us, and try to keep us in dear memory. And earlier in the same letter, explaining why she is bringing the children with her into death, rather than allowing them to survive into a world without National Socialism. The world that comes after the Führer and National Socialism is not any longer worth living in, and therefore I took the children with me, for they are too good for the life that would follow. Too good for the life that would follow. Read that sentence as many times as you need to. It does not become clearer with repetition. It becomes, if anything, more opaque a window into a mind that had reorganized itself so completely around a single belief that the lives of 6 children could be absorbed into its logic without remainder. She was not, in the clinical sense, insane. The people who knew her in the bunker described her as lucid, composed, deliberate. She knew what she was doing. She had planned it carefully. She had arranged the morphine and the doctor and the room and the nightclothes and the ribbons in the girl's hair. She had thought of everything. This is the thing about Magda Goebbels that no documentary has quite managed to sit with long enough. She was not a monster in the way that the word is usually meant something alien and incomprehensible. Something that bears no relationship to ordinary human experience. She was a person who had made a series of choices, each one following from the last, each one narrowing the range of what she was capable of imagining, until she arrived at a place where what she did in that room seemed, to her, like the only possible expression of love. That is not a comfortable thing to say. It is not meant to be. It is meant to be true. Harald Quandt received a letter in a prison camp in North Africa. He read it. He never spoke publicly about its contents for the rest of his life. He was 23 years old. He had 6 dead half-siblings and a mother who had killed them, and a stepfather who had organized the cultural annihilation of an entire civilization, and a father, Günther Quandt, whose factories had used slave labor to manufacture weapons for the war that had just ended. He went home. He rebuilt his life. He became in time a successful industrialist. He had 5 children of his own. He died in a plane crash in Italy in 1967 at the age of 45. He never spoke about the letter. There is a cemetery on the western edge of Moscow. It is not famous. It does not appear in guidebooks. Tourists do not visit it. It sits in an unremarkable suburb, amid the kind of urban ordinariness that accumulates around the edges of large cities, apartment blocks, small shops, the infrastructure of ordinary life going on in the vicinity of the dead. In this cemetery, there is a grave. The headstone reads, in Korean, "The grave of Sung Hae-rim." Wait, that is someone else's story. Let us come back. In Tel Aviv, there is a grave. Haim al-Osrof is buried there, the young man who gave a girl in Berlin a Star of David necklace, who left for Palestine and a cause larger than himself, who was shot on a beach in June 1933 at the age of 34. His grave has been visited by historians and students, and people who know the story of the Zionist movement and understand what his death meant to it. Almost none of them know about Magda. Almost none of them know that the woman who became the first lady of Nazi Germany had once, in another life, won his star. In the records of Buchenwald concentration camp, there is an entry. It records the death of Richard Friedlander, businessman, stepfather, the man who gave a girl his name and raised her as his daughter. The entry is brief. It contains a number and a date. It does not contain the name of the woman who carried his surname through her childhood and then allowed it to be removed from her birth certificate by a man who found it undesirable. It does not mention that she was, at the time of his death, seated at the dinner table of the man who had built the camp where he died. The record does not know this. Records do not know things. They only contain what someone thought to write down. Harald Quandt came home from North Africa in 1945. He was 23 years old, and he was the only one left. He had 5 half-sisters and 1 half-brother who had been put to bed in a concrete room under a burning city and had not woken up. He had a mother who had made that decision and written him a letter explaining it in terms of loyalty and pride. He had a stepfather whose name was already becoming, in the rubble of post-war Germany, one of the most toxic in the language. He had a biological father, Günther Quandt, whose factories had used forced labor and who would manage, in the way that very wealthy men often manage, to move through the denazification process without losing the essential infrastructure of his fortune. Harald Quandt took what he inherited and rebuilt. He became a successful industrialist. He had 5 children. He lived quietly, away from the attention that his family history might otherwise have attracted. He died in 1967 inches, a plane crash in Italy. He was 45 years old. His children, the grandchildren of Magda Goebbels, the great-grandchildren of Richard Friedlander's adopted family, are alive today. Some of them manage the legacy of one of Germany's largest industrial dynasties. They live, in the ordinary sense, ordinary lives. They do not speak about their grandmother. Somewhere in the archives of a research institution, in the private holdings of a historian, in a box that has not been opened in decades, there may be more letters, more documents, more of whatever Magda Goebbels left behind in the months before she went underground. We do not know. The record is incomplete, as records of women's lives so often are not because the women were absent, but because the people who preserved history did not always think to preserve theirs. What we have is this: a girl in Berlin, 1918, a necklace, a language she learned for someone she loved, a life she might have lived in another country with another name, pointed toward a future that had nothing to do with what she became, and then 27 years of choices, each one following from the last, a name removed from a birth certificate, a stepfather not saved, a marriage maintained by order of a man who needed it for his image, 6 children brought underground into the final hours of a regime built on the erasure of everything the girl with the Star of David had once stood beside. There is a question that this story cannot answer. It has no answer available to it, because the person who could answer it did not leave a memoir, did not give an interview, did not write down in any document that has survived what she believed she was doing, or why she believed she was justified in doing it. The question is simple. At what point did she stop being the girl with the Star of David and become the woman in the bunker? Was there a moment? A single decision that turned one into the other? Or was it gradual, an erosion so slow that she never felt the ground shifting beneath her, never noticed that she was standing somewhere entirely different from where she had started? We do not know. What we know is that the distance between those two women, the girl and the woman, the necklace and the bunker, is exactly the distance this story has been trying to measure, and that it is, even now, impossible to cross without feeling the weight of it. The 6 children are buried in a cemetery in Munich. Their grave is a single stone, 6 names, 6 dates: Helga, Hilde, Helmut, Holde, Hedda, Heide. The dates span 12 years of births and a single date of death, the 1st of May 1945. People leave flowers there sometimes. The flowers are always for the children. They are never for their mother.